Good morning. It's Sunday, March 5th, which I should remember since, as many of you know, yesterday was my birthday. And we are happy to welcome Roberta Kwall. Now, she has a book out, which I'll tell you about, but she is also a American law professor, and she teaches at DePaul University of Law and received her AB in Religious Studies from Brown University and a JD from the University of Pennsylvania Law School, and has a master's degree in Jewish studies. Wow. But what we really want to talk about today is her book, Remixed Judaism, Preserving Tradition in a Diverse World, offers an eloquent and thoughtful new vision for all Jews seeking a sense of belonging in a changing world, regardless of their current level of observance. So she's going to tell us all about the book, and I will post the link to the book a couple times this morning, and you'll be able to check it out. So with no further ado, Roberta.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. It's really a pleasure to be with everybody here today. And thank you all for joining this today. I know you had a wonderful festivity last night and an early Hag Sameach, Happy Purim to everyone. All right, so actually, a couple days before Purim is actually a very fitting time to talk about remixed Judaism. So as Vanessa said, yes, I am a law professor. I've been teaching at DePaul University College of Law for a while, and no, Jewish law and Jewish culture is not on the bar exam. So you might be wondering, well, how did we get here, right? I always like hearing about the backstories of books. And Vanessa, thank you. You just posted the Amazon link to Remixed Judaism. So I started my career as a law professor teaching intellectual property, and that is the law that covers copyrights. And the area of intellectual property that I particularly specialized in is a doctrine known as moral rights. So it really doesn't have anything to do with morality, but what moral rights really is all about is an author being able to legally claim attribution for their work, and also prevent their work from being modified or changed without their permission. Now, some of you may think, well, of course the law protects that. Of course, copyright law protects that. And no, take my word for it. The US is probably the only country, I think, in the world where that's not the case. You have to contract for those protections. So I wrote a lot about that. And one of the issues that I constantly dealt with in all of my writings on this topic, and I wrote a book published by Stanford Press on this, I wrote many articles on this. And one of the questions that I really grappled with was, well, okay, how much can a work that's protected by copyright law, art, literature, music, poetry, works such as that, how much can it be changed by someone else and still be the work of the author? I thought about that question every which way and wrote about it every which way, because it's an important question, because if it's modified beyond recognition, is it the author's work, right? So that was really the issue that I basically grappled with. And one day, I kind of woke up with this eureka moment, and this eureka moment looks something like this. It was, you can say the same thing about Jewish tradition, and especially Jewish legal tradition, right? Like, how much can it be changed and still be considered Judaism? I thought this was such a captivating idea. So I decided maybe I should write about that. That should maybe be my next book. So there were a couple of problems with that. First of all, I had to get a publisher who would be interested in publishing this. And second of all, I felt like I needed more education about the legal process of Judaism, which is known as halakha, the legal process of Judaism. So I took care of the lack of education by enrolling for a master's degree. I had majored in religion in college, and I had a decent background about Judaism to begin with, but I felt I needed more. So I enrolled in a program to get my master's degree. Fortunately, this was back still when you could call an editor of a press and get them on the phone. Those days are long gone, that you can't do that anymore. But now, then you could. And I happened to get an editor at Oxford who he was not Jewish, but he was very interested in religion. And he really liked this idea. So he said, think about it, submit a proposal. And I did. And I said to him, it's going to take me 7 years to write this book because I knew how much I needed to learn and I knew what I needed. I had a good sense for what I needed to do. And I knew I needed a long time. And sure enough, 7 years to the date, I submitted the manuscript to Oxford. That book was called The Myth of the Cultural Jew, The Myth of the Cultural Jew. Now, that's an academic book. It has a lot of footnotes. It's written for an academic audience, mostly law professors, rabbis, Jewish studies professionals. It was a very detailed, oriented book. But the second to last chapter of that book was actually the last chapter of that book was on American Jews, the American Jewish community. And as I was writing that book, right, I was finishing that up around 2013. And as I was writing that book, there was a very important study of the American Jewish community that came out, and that was called the Pew Report. Now, some of you maybe have heard of the Pew Report. When the study came out, there was lots of hand-wringing. I can see Vanessa shaking her head. I'm sure as an educator, you're very familiar with it. Lots of hand-wringing, and it was like, oh my gosh, people aren't practicing Judaism, and there was just a lot of distraught reaction to the Pew Report, which to be fair, had content in it that's cause for concern, no question about it. And as I was writing that last chapter about American Judaism, I kind of said to myself, I really wanted to write something practical, something that would appeal to a wide audience, not just academics and Jewish professionals, that would really take this issue of Jewish observance and put it front and center, and really make the case for why Jews, and when I say Jews, I'm talking primarily about what I call religiously liberal Jews. And how do I define religiously liberal Jews? I define those Jews as basically non-Orthodox Jews, anything from the conservative movement all the way to the left. So when I say religiously liberal Jews, I'm speaking to people in this room or in this Zoom room. I'm speaking, to people who are members of North Shore Suburban Synagogue Bethel. They would also call themselves religiously liberal. So that's who I'm speaking to. So how can we talk about Jewish practice in a way that's going to resonate with more religiously liberal Jews? And so that was the backdrop of this book. I wanted to write something that would be basically appeal to a wide audience, that would be written and accessible to a wide audience, but would still emphasize the point that when it comes to religious practice, we have to be thinking about this. Now, why am I talking to religiously liberal Jews as opposed to Orthodox Jews? And by the way, I will share with you, and I'm proud of this, Remix Judaism was actually endorsed by about 25 Jewish professionals, which was so gratifying. But among those who endorsed it, both on the back cover as well as inside in the praise pages, but Jewish professionals from every movement, including Orthodox Jewish professionals, endorsed the book. And why is that? I think that's because there are things in Remix Judaism that really do speak to every movement, right? My target audience primarily is religiously liberal Jews, but I think there is something about the concepts and the types of examples that I talk about that really resonates with everyone. And I would say now, even more so than when I was writing the book, that I believe that Jews from the entire Jewish spectrum need to be talking to each other more. I am a firm believer that the polarization that we see in our country also is there. It exists within our Jewish community. That's my current project I'm working on. And the only solution is we have to be able to talk to each other. So yes, the Orthodox need to be able to talk to religiously liberal, and it goes both ways. And so I think this is a book that can be appreciated. But the difference between a religiously liberal Jew and an Orthodox Jew, by and large, is this. And this is something that actually Vanessa and I were chatting about in the few minutes before this program. The majority, not all, but the majority of Orthodox Jews observe the way they do because they believe they are commanded to do so. Okay. I'm not saying every single Orthodox person believes that. Okay. There have been studies that show that not everyone does, but by and large, it's the mantra of Orthodox Judaism. So the mitzvot, the commandments, Orthodox Jews believe they observe Shabbat because they are commanded to observe Shabbat, for example. And there's a way that Shabbat has to be observed. And there's a lot of rules that surround Shabbat, for example. Okay. But religiously liberal Jews don't think like that. By and large, it's a different way of thinking. And so religiously liberal Jews don't do what they do observance-wise because it's commanded. There's different motivators that are operative within the religiously liberal community. And because of that, the issue of observance, the issue of religious practice, the issues of ritual, I believe, have to be approached differently because it has to be couched in a framework and a language that religiously Jews are going to understand. But I think one thing that is clear, I would say for the majority of Jews who identify as Jews by religion. All right, so what is a Jew by religion, and where am I drawing this language from? Okay, Jew by religion, again, this is a Pew term, a Pew Report term. I mentioned the Pew Report a few moments ago. Basically, the American Jewish community, according to the Pew Report, which is considered the gold standard survey of how American Jews believe, think, and practice, okay, has divided Jews, okay, into two categories: Jews by religion and Jews of no religion. The Jews of no religion, which is, by the way, 25% of American Jews. They're not a small number, but the Jews of no religion basically would say, I'm Jewish, but I don't consider Judaism a religion. I don't consider myself to be practicing the Jewish religion at all, okay? But I'm Jewish by ancestry, ethnicity, what have you. The 75% of American Jews who consider themselves Jewish by religion, of that roughly 75%, the vast majority are not Orthodox. Orthodoxy represents roughly 15 to 20% of American Jews, though they are growing in number. So the Jews by religion are basically, for the most part, Jews who are at the Zoom room today, Jews who attended services either online or in person yesterday, and their children. Okay, they identify. When you say, what's your religion? They'll say, I'm Jewish, right? Doesn't mean that they're observing everything or maybe even too much of anything, but they will say, when you say, what's your religion? They'll say, I am Jewish. All right. So that is the group of people for whom I essentially wrote this book. Okay. And so I think it's fair to say that all Jews by religion, and maybe even a few who would say they're Jewish but not by religion, would identify with a narrative that I have in Remixed Judaism that I think really encapsulates the concept of Remixed Judaism. So this narrative it's actually from the Talmud. So the Talmud is, of course, the book, the primary source book for Jewish law and Jewish lore. Because a lot of what's in the Talmud is not legally based. No lawyer would pick up the Talmud and recognize it as a law book, although it's the foundation for a lot of Jewish law. But it's got wonderful stories. That's what I love about Talmud. I love the stories. I love the narrative, and this is one of my favorites. All right, so this is an exact English translation of the Aramaic, and I do have some Talmud narratives in here because I want my audience to understand what Talmud looks like and sounds like, right? So but this narrative I think is very special. So I want to start by reading this to you. All right, so this narrative, by the way, is about a man named Honi, he's well known in the Talmudic circles. In other words, he appears in several narratives in the Talmud. But listen to this story about Honi. One day, Honi was journeying on a road, and he saw a man planting a carob tree. He asked him, "How long does it take for this tree to bear fruit?" And the man replied, 70 years. He then further asked him, "Are you certain you're going to live another 70 years?" And the man replied, "I found ready-grown carob trees in this world. As my forefathers planted them for me, so too do I plant them for my children." Honi sat down to have a meal, and sleep overcame him. As he slept, a rocky formation enclosed upon him, which hid him from sight, and he continued to sleep for another 70 years. This is Talmudic narrative. You have to take this with a grain of salt, the timing, right? This is not like the timing as we think of it. When he awoke, he saw a man gathering the fruit of the carob tree, and he asked him, "Are you the man who planted the tree?" And the man replied, "I am his grandson. I am his grandson." So what I love about this narrative is I think it contains two really important lessons. The first is that it is up to one generation to plant the trees, to pave the road for the coming generation, religiously and otherwise. All right, but that is how we transmit tradition. It is transmitted l'dor v'ador, from one generation to the next. So that is a very important lesson that's embedded in this narrative. But the other lesson that I see embedded into this narrative is that we always want a world. I liken the carob tree to Jewish tradition. We always want a world in which we're going to have carob fruit or Jewish tradition. We don't want a world without Jewish tradition because it has survived for thousands of years and has benefited not just Jews, but the world over. There's so much wisdom and so much joy in Jewish tradition. We don't ever want to lose that. But just like the carob fruit might look a little different from one generation to the next and taste a little different from one generation to the next, the same is true, I think, with Jewish tradition. Coming back to what I said a few moments ago, like what started me down this road initially, how much can Jewish traditions change and still be considered Jewish tradition? There's no magic bullet answer to that question, but that basically is the question that religiously liberal Jews need to grapple with. It really is. We want there to always be a world of Jewish tradition, but religiously liberal Jews are not going to practice that tradition as Orthodox Jews do today, or even as our ancestors necessarily did, hundreds, if not 1,000 years ago. There's going to be changes. There's going to be modifications. The question is, how much is too much, right? When does it cross the line and it's no longer Judaism? So you're not going to get a magic bullet answer to that question. But what you are going to get is a way that religiously liberal Jews can think about how they approach their own religious practice and how what they do can be a model for transmitting it to children, grandchildren, or other special little people that may be in their lives, nieces, nephews, etc. Okay, good friends, cousins, whatever that may be. So remixed Judaism, basically, my basic core thesis of remixed Judaism, I will tell you what it is, and then I'll give you some examples of how that thesis plays out. My basic thesis is that I believe it is possible for individuals and their families to find an authentic, but yet personal meaning in Jewish tradition when several conditions exist. Why is a personal meaning important? Because if something matters to you personally, you will do it. You will observe. That's what motivates religiously liberal Jews. It's not necessarily the command from God. That doesn't mean, by the way, that religiously liberal Jews do not believe in God. I'm not saying that. That's a whole nother question. I'm actually doing a scholar in residence this coming weekend. I'm really excited about it, not just going to Florida where it's warmer, but just having this opportunity. But my opening talk is going to be about faith, right? But I don't want to focus on faith here. That's not really what our topic is about here. That's a whole nother discourse. But what motivates religiously liberal Jews is really the idea that if something matters to them personally, they will do it. It matters to them, and therefore they will observe. So I think when the following conditions exist, it is possible for religiously liberal Jews to form an authentic yet personal meaning in Jewish tradition. So what are these elements? So first of all, religiously liberal Jews are going to exercise individuality as to what rituals and traditions they elect to incorporate in their lives. They are not observing, again, in the way Orthodox individuals do, who are basically, looking at the entirety of what is commanded. That's just not what goes on in religiously liberal circles. So they're exercising choice, they're exercising individuality. And that's, by the way, very consistent with Reform theology as well. Okay, secondly, and very importantly, people infuse the elements that they choose to practice with their own personal meaning. In other words, they select what they want to practice, but they also have their own personal meaning that they infuse that tradition with. And that's really, really important because, again, that's going to motivate people to practice. It matters to them. It means something to them. The third element is consistency, and that's really important when it comes to transmission. You're not going to be able to really transmit tradition unless it's something that is done on a consistent basis. So the consistency is important. And also, and here's where it gets a little bit gray, right? We have to live in the gray here. The consistency in performing these elements, but these elements these traditions, these rituals that people are choosing and infusing with their meaning and practicing consistently, they do need to embrace, at least to some degree, the authenticity of Jewish tradition. I'll give some examples about that. All right. But that's where people say, well, how do you know? How much is too much? When is it no longer authentic? And there's no easy answer to those questions. But again, as one of the chefs that I interviewed for this book, for the chapter on food, said, a bacon wrapped matzo ball is just not authentic, right? So there has to be a degree of authenticity of the tradition. Joy, right? You got to focus on the joy, particularly when you're trying to transmit and you're dealing with kids, right? You can't focus on the no's, the do nots. You've got to focus on the joy. That's what's going to make the practice appealing to the next generation. And so what I'm really talking about is a concept that is really emphasizing mindfulness and intentionality. And that's where the Orthodox professionals who have read this book that's really what draws them. Because sometimes in Orthodoxy, that mindfulness and that intentionality is not front and center as much as it could or should be. And that's what a lot of people who have told me, who have read the book, that are Orthodox rabbis and Jewish professionals, said, we need to be thinking about this too, even though the way we're going to be practicing is different. So again, it's not about dotting the I's and crossing the T's for how you are practicing it. It's not about following Jewish law meticulously. It's about embracing what is meaningful to you from the tradition, performing it consistently, performing it joyfully. That is really the essence of remixed Judaism. So let me give you a couple of examples. So one example, which is actually not in the book because it happened after the book went to press, but I think it's a good example of remix anyway. So I have 3 daughters, and one of my daughters, who at that point was talking about her boyfriend, who is now her husband, said to me, Mom, I want to tell you something. Her husband, Jeremy, he's not eating pork anymore. And I'm like, oof, this is wonderful. I was like so excited. And I said, I'm really, really happy. And I said, so is he doing this because he wants to tap into his Jewish tradition? And she said, not at all. And I said, oh, okay. I said, all right, well, that's fine. So I said, so what's motivating him? And my daughter said, well, Mom, he feels badly for the animals. I said, oh, that's terrific. In fact, there's a wonderful book called The Sacred Table, which was published by the CAR Press, that's the Reform Movement's press, called The Sacred Table. And it is really a series of essays by Reform rabbis about their ethic. They're trying to create an ethic of keeping kosher for Reform Jews, right? Which I thought was really, really interesting. And I used that book a lot in my chapter on food. So I thought this was wonderful. So I said, this is great. So all right, so the animals, this is great. It's a great reason. I'm so glad. I'm happy for him. And then I just said to her, wait a minute though. I said, so he's not eating pork anymore, but what about beef? Is he like giving up all meat? And she said, oh, no. He's not going to give up all meat. Well, then I was really confused. And I said, well, I don't get it. I'm glad, don't get me wrong. I'm thrilled that he's not going to be eating pork or bacon, but why, what's the difference? And she said to me in this very exasperated tone, Mom, don't you know that the pigs, they're treated so much worse than the cows are? I burst into laughing. It was just so funny because obviously I didn't really know that. And I just thought that was really funny. But then she said, but he's not doing it for the right reason. And I said, there is no right reason. That's the whole point. Jeremy is doing something that matters to him, that means something to him, and he's doing something that's authentically Jewish, right? I said, it doesn't matter why he's doing it. It is okay. And one day when you have children and your children ask you about this, you can say, that this is one of the, standard practices of Judaism, not to eat pork or pork products. Daddy may feel that he's doing it to help the animals, and that's great, but this is still an authentic Jewish practice. So that idea, well, it's the wrong reason, or we're doing it wrong. Okay, that's something that remixed Judaism doesn't embrace, right? What does it mean to do something wrong? So let's talk about lighting Shabbat candles. All right. So this isn't something that is as much of an issue for the Reform congregations that I visit with. It's more of an issue in the conservative movement, where Jewish law is still regarded as being binding on the community. That's not the case in Reform theology. So lighting Friday night candles, right? Well, Jewish law says you don't light them after sundown. And in fact, lighting fire is one of the few biblically prohibited activities in the Torah. So do you light your candles after sundown? Now, all of my girls have asked me this question. And since I'm not a rabbi and I don't have to necessarily, take anything particular into account when giving, legal advice, I say to my daughters, look, do you believe that lighting a match is a sin? Do you believe that? And of course, the answer I always get is no. I've never heard anybody actually that I've spoken to said, yes, I do believe that. I've never actually spoken at an Orthodox synagogue. That's probably why. But nonetheless, typically the answer is no. And so my answer is, well, if you don't believe that that's a sin, then yes, light your candles when you get home from work, whenever that may be, so that you take Shabbat into your home and you start Shabbat. You're at least setting those boundaries of time and space for Shabbat. And that is what they do, right? I will be honest, I light my candles, at the traditional time. But when I talk to my kids and they ask, I would rather see them light their candles whenever they can get home and do a meaningful Shabbat than not light candles. That's not the same advice you would get if you talk to a Chabad rabbi or their spouses, because they would not want to encourage you breaking the law. But again, this is a remix, but it is still an authentic Jewish practice to light Shabbat candles. People often say to me, if there's one thing you would recommend, one thing at all, that families today should take into account, what would it be? And what I always say is, those Pew reports that I've mentioned already a few times, one came out in 2013 and one in 2020. Basically, the data was very similar. And what, by the way, before I get into the one thing that I would always recommend, I will also say that the 2020 Pew report did have one piece of what I found particularly disturbing news, and I'm not alone. All the commentators on Pew were saying this as well. What the 2020 report showed is that we are now moving into a American Jewish space where we have two completely divergent communities who basically don't want anything to do with each other. And that was even more pronounced in 2020 than it was in 2013. And by that, I mean, the Orthodox group, who are becoming more and more observant, more stringent to these, and those who are religiously liberal, who are unfortunately becoming less and less observant. Gen Z, those are people born between 1995 and 2010. They're the people sitting in my law school classrooms right now. They are the least observant of any generation. I've been doing a lot of research on Gen Z for the book I'm working on right now. And it's very clear that they have the least interest in anything religiously traditional. And by the way, that is as true for the Jewish subjects of the studies in Gen Z as for the non-Jewish ones. Religion in general in our society is declining in importance. So if there were one thing that I would recommend really strongly about what every family or even partially Jewish family should be thinking about, if they want to keep Jewish tradition alive, would be a 1-hour technology-free Shabbat evening dinner, beginning with the blessings over the candles and the wine, the very short blessings, and the challah, of course. 1 hour, no technology, family time, friend time, and maybe the first paragraph of the Grace After Meals, which is very fun to sing with kids because you can all do all kinds of little hand motions and sounds with it that they really kind of like. If every Jewish or even partially Jewish family did just that, Pew would look completely different, completely different. We wouldn't have 25% Jews of no religion, right? And Pew also shows that the Jews of no religion produce more Jews of no religion. That the Pew statistics in that is very, very clear. So what I'd like to do is just close with telling you a little bit about what subjects I do cover in the book. And then I want to give you one last very sweet example of remixed Judaism. And then I'd love to throw it out for questions and comments and discussion. So in this book, I thought very carefully about the content and the chapters that I wanted to explore, because of course, in a book that especially you want to be accessible to a broad range, you have to pick your topics carefully. And so of course, my first chapter is on Shabbat and holidays, because that is the core. Those are the foundational particularities of Jewish tradition. And similarly, the chapter that follows that is on food. Right. I wasn't really that excited about writing a chapter on food because I'm not someone that really loves to spend time in the kitchen, to be very honest, but I actually had a lot of fun writing that chapter. And as I said, it was really a very fun deep dive into the role that food plays, not just in Jewish law, but in Jewish culture, and also how easy it is to take the dietary laws and infuse them with personal meanings. And again, the Reform Movement's book, The Sacred Table, was really, really helpful, a really helpful source for me, along with other things that I looked at as well for this kind of an inquiry. I have a chapter on marriage and family, and that of course deals with intermarriage as well, because in writing to the audience that I'm writing to, that's a really important piece of it. We can talk more about that in the Q&A if people like. I have a chapter on Jewish children's education and B'nai Mitzvah, bat and bar mitzvahs. That's changed a lot over the past 20 years. And that in and of itself is a huge remix. And I talk about the developments. One of my favorite chapters to write, even though I was not a grandparent for most of the time that I wrote this chapter, was a chapter on grandparenting. Now, people have told me consistently that chapter is worth the price of the whole book, right? But this is like, what can grandparents do? And that chapter, it was written in a more fictional way. I devised 3 hypothetical couples based on composites of my friends and gave them challenges in terms of how to deal with their grandchildren. And that was actually a lot of fun for me to write that chapter. Tikkun Olam, right? Tikkun Olam, that is sort of the banner of so many congregations right now. Social justice, Tikkun Olam, what role does it play? I will tell you that the role it plays is significant, but it can't be the only role if you want to continue Jewish tradition, if you want there to be carob trees, in other words, and carob fruit. And that's because Tikkun Olam, or social justice, is more universalized, right? But in contrast, you need the particulars as well, the particulars of Jewish tradition. I do have a chapter on Jewish mourning. And the role and the staying power that Jewish ritual around the mourning process plays. For example, virtually every time I have ever known of a Jewish person that has died, no matter how much or how little the religion plays in their lives, there's always some type of a shiva, right? Even if it's just a couple hours. But I've almost never heard, maybe with one exception, of a situation where there was no shiva in any way, shape, or form. And then my last chapter is actually about authenticity, and it's also about faith. So I want to close with giving you another example of remix, which I think is a really, really sweet one. This actually story was something that I found in the JUF News. It was written by a Reform young mom who was Reform. She was raised Reform. She's still affiliated. She's affiliated at North Shore. And she talked about when her 3 sons were younger. They're in grade school now. They were more in preschool at this time. They were having nightmares. They couldn't go to sleep. They were scared of monsters or whatever it was. And so she decided to lay down with each of her sons individually and sing the first line of the Shema, the core Jewish prayer, with her sons, each one individually. And it worked. It settled them down. And now her boys, who are in grade school, as I said, one's going to have a bar mitzvah in a couple of years, actually. They do this themselves. Now, Why did she do this? She didn't do this because it's commanded. It actually is commanded to say the Shema before you go to bed. Okay. Observant Jews do say a particular version of the Shema before they go to bed, but that wasn't what she was doing. And she's also not doing the whole prayer. She's just doing that first line, that most Jews at least know. But she was tapping into the tradition, and she was, with a personal meaning, right? And then she said, and she wrote in her article, and it was so wonderful. I love hearing a little bit of Torah on my boys' lips before they go to bed. And I thought, oh, that's so beautiful, right? But that's such a lovely, lovely conception of remixed Judaism, because it's doing exactly what the point of it is. You do something with meaning, you do it consistently, you focus on the joy, and hopefully you set the stage for that being a part of the life in those whom you're trying to influence. So I think with that, I would love to open it up for discussion and Q&A.
Any questions? Don't make me go first here, people. Excuse me. All right, well, I'll start off with, your book was nominated by the Jewish Book Council, and in the description it says, many mature readers will recognize themselves navigating the intricate dance between what we've always done and what if we tried to do it this way. Could you talk a little bit more about that, and then we'll get Alice.
Sure. So, I mean, that's really what the book is about. I mean, it comes back to that question I started with. How much can Jewish tradition change and it's still Jewish tradition, right? And again, there's no simple answer to that. But I do think what is important is that Jewish ritual, okay? Jewish practices, the particularities of Jewish tradition, right? That is something that I do think religiously liberal Jews across the board need to be thinking about more, need to be incorporating into their lives more. And it's also a topic that isn't necessarily front and center in the Jewish discourse, right? I mean, I read the Jewish media religiously. That means every day, I get the emails from the Forward and the Jewish Journal and JTA and the New York Jewish Week, and as well as a whole bunch of other stuff too. And in most of the media, in many of the synagogues, Jewish ritual is, it's just not a topic that people are talking about. And what I think is really important about remixed Judaism is it's making the case for reintroducing that topic into the discourse. The particularities of how the ritual is observed, what the book is trying to show, is that there can be a range, and that range is okay. But what's important is that the ritual be done, the practice be done. That's what's significant.
Alice.
Yeah, boy, you raised so many interesting things. So my mind, of course, was going to my family, and I went back 2 generations. So I had 2 grandmothers that one, I don't know, she was completely, she didn't really do anything Jewish. Except probably making Jewish food. The other one was like very religious, but didn't, I don't know. I never saw like the ritual.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, then go down to the next generation. My mother was like her mother, very, religion wasn't that important. My father was like his mother, but we didn't have much ritual in our home. Go down to the next generation. I'm, like very involved at our synagogue, and lots of it is it's very important to me. My sister, her son was bar mitzvahed, her daughter, nothing. And then she and her husband, nothing, really nothing. Then go down to my next generation. my daughter's in a mixed marriage and considers herself Jewish. They really, I mean, they light the Hanukkah candles. We have Seders, Rosh Hashanah dinners. She doesn't go to services anymore. There's not that much ritual in her own. My son married a young woman who was raised in a modern Orthodox family, went to Jewish day school. They're affiliated. They do everything. I mean, they do all the rituals. Mm-hmm. So I guess what I'm saying, it seems like it's such a, and I think you said this at the beginning, it's like such a personal thing, like what speaks to you. I started thinking like, well, my husband and I really, we're very inconsistent. We really don't do a Shabbat dinner. I mean, it's just the two of us in our home now. But what I'm saying is, it just seems like I think ritual is important, and I get what you're saying, but it seems like a lot of it is just like what speaks to you, and no matter what kind of home you were raised in, you're gonna take this and not take that. I don't know.
So I want to push back on that a little bit, just a little bit. Okay. Sure. I mean, yes. I mean, clearly, again, when you're dealing with religiously liberal Jews, you're not dealing with people who are observing the entire system of Jewish law. Okay. We are also dealing with the stories that you spoke about in terms of your family is actually very, very common. I can tell you that even in the circles that I see, right, which is, we raised our family. We lived in Deerfield when we were raising our family, so we belonged to Moriah. A lot of kids there were going to day school. We then moved to Highland Park, and we're in walking distance to Bethel. So that also is a fairly traditional conservative community. Uh-huh. But I look at the kids that are the same age as my girls. Okay, my girls are all millennials, right? And a lot of their kids went through the Camp Ramah system, which is the conservative movement's camp. They went to Schechter, a lot of the kids. And I'm looking at observance levels, right? Because, my kids still know their friends, right? From those times, and they're still in contact with a lot of them. And observance levels have dropped. There's no question about that. The ones that actually, where it doesn't drop, is a few in that community actually have moved over to Orthodoxy, to modern Orthodoxy, right? But outside of that, even though these kids might have grown up in kosher homes, many are not keeping kosher. In fact, most are not keeping kosher. Even though many of them went to Shabbat services every single week, that's not happening now. So as a general matter, we know that religion is declining among religiously liberal Jews. We know that. And what Remixed Judaism is trying to say is, okay, if this stays the way it is, you're going to end up with a lot of Jews of no religion, which is kind of, the patterns that we're seeing. And you're going to end up with a growing group of Orthodox Jews. In fact, Steven Pinker, who is a professor at Yale University, has run the numbers and projected that by 2050, what American Judaism is going to look like, because Israel's a different story, but what American Judaism is going to look like is 1/3 Orthodox and very, very observant Orthodox, 1/3 religiously liberal, right? Right now it's 85%, 85%, 1/3, and 1/3 Jews of no religion. That's the projections. So I'm trying to push back on that. And so I'm not saying anything goes. What I'm saying is, I'm saying, okay, religiously liberal Jews, you got to do a little bit more, right? You may not be doing it exactly according to the law, right? But you got to be doing a little bit more if you want to see Jewish tradition transmitted. And that's true, by the way, I'm going to suggest, that's true for couples that are married to other Jews, as well as intermarried, because what we find in the millennial generations, and this is going to continue, and Gen X is, they're probably in their 40s, very early 50s. Millennials typically are in their, 30s to early 40s, right? What we're finding, what we see of those generations, essentially, is that, again, there's decreased interest in religion across the board. That's filtered down to Gen Z, the ones sitting in my classrooms right now, who have the highest number of intermarried parents. But what's interesting about the millennials and the Gen Zs is whether they're in married or intermarried, I say the difference is really one of degree, not necessarily substance. So if you have if you have kids in this range, what you see is your kids are super busy. The kids are programmed doing lots of different activities, and fitting their Jewish life into their lives is a challenge. It's also a challenge because we are a minority religious culture, and the rest of the world is not operating on Jewish time, and that makes it challenging too. So what my book is urging families to do is to think more about how to grow that slice, the Jewish slice of your pie, right? That's really, and that's important for both in married as well as intermarried families, because the differences are ones of degree. It is true that intermarried families tend to produce children who intermarry. Pew shows us that. They're also less religious, and Pew shows us that too. But the realities of day-to-day life, even for in-married millennials and in-married Gen Xers who are religiously liberal, they're not religious, right? They're not observant, not in the way many of them were raised. And what Remixed Judaism is trying to do is say, look, here's a way you can think about Jewish practice that can be consistent with who you are, what you believe, and what you ultimately want, which is to see Jewish continuity.
We have a question in the chat, and then Andy, I'll get to you. Bill Rosen said, you initially spoke about copyright law. Can you give us examples of how this applies to Judaism Remix?
Remix is the solution for the question of how much can Judaism change without how much can a religion or a tradition change and still be a tradition? Okay, that's what Remix is designed to do. The idea for Remix came from my writings on copyright law, which looked at that same question in the context of works of authorship. How much can a work of authorship change and still be considered the work of the author? So they're different. The content is different. The issue is the same, but the content and the application is completely different.
Okay, very interesting. Andy, go ahead.
Okay. I don't want to just, offer my experience, although I think it is a little bit relevant. I grew up in the 60s. I went to Bethel, the conservative congregation. And as an adult, I've always said I've stayed Jewish despite that upbringing. And I always had the feeling that there was a gap in what is observance and what is religiosity? Where is the faith part of it? And I did not see that. I saw, I have to be bar mitzvahed. I have to do this. I thought this is not for me. So I've always felt that I wanted to integrate the ethics into the ritual. That would make it meaningful and a reason to stay. And that's what's proved out for me. It just was, okay, I could be a good person and a good Jew. And it's just not really what you're seeing in the majority, but having gone to Bethel and being a much more involved Jew now.
So I think, Andy, is that?
Yeah.
Okay. Your square kind of went away in the Zoom chat. I think you raise a really good point, right? And it's something that I struggled with a little bit when I was writing Remixed Judaism, like what's the role of faith, right? And I didn't really want to. I do talk about faith in the epilogue, okay? And what the epilogue talks about essentially is that faith is a more fluid concept for Jews than it is for people of other religions, and I talk about how and why that's the case. But the idea of Remixed Judaism is one that can be embraced by people who have strong faith in God, by people who maybe don't have strong faith in God, or that people that don't know. And that's okay. That is okay. I mean, the whole idea, practice and faith are two separate things. They can go together. They don't have to go together. And so I didn't really want to limit the audience of Remixed Judaism because by saying, well, you have to have a certain faith in God, because the truth of the matter is, that there are people who have a very strong Jewish practice for whom the faith is not operative. And there's a whole group, by the way, called the socially orthodox, right? There was an article written about this group by an attorney, and he published it in Commentary Magazine, which is a pretty conservative venue. But he wrote about the socially orthodox, and that is true. I mean, faith is a personal thing. Now, I will say this. And this is really very consistent with what I'm working on right now. I do think that it is unfortunate where we are in this country, where faith is not uppermost in a lot of people's minds, and it's not, and we know that from the studies that have been done. I think it's particularly, I think it's a problem. And if you look at the studies of Gen Z in particular, they're the least religious, but they're the most depressed, they're the most anxious, and it's not just because of COVID, right? And so I personally believe that as Jews, we need to be talking more about faith. We need more God talk. We need to talk about those spiritual underpinnings of the religion. That's not something Jews typically like to talk about, but I'm saying I think we do need to talk about them. But again, ritual and faith, they can go together. They don't have to go together. But I do think we need to have more discussions about faith, because I think that would help us.
I probably misspoke a little bit and used that word, and I would say the ethics and the morality that was what I learned was consistent with what I felt was important, and that led me back to wanting to participate. So the God part, I don't know, our to credit, I guess, to who he is, our grandson had his first day of religious school, and in kindergarten, he comes home and he says, I really like talking about holidays and God.
Yes. Yes, I totally get that. I can totally relate to that based on things I've heard from my grandson. So but that's great. That is great. Listen,
we have in the chat, Richard Edelheit said, have you read the book The Plot? And this it's by the author, I always forget her name, Jean Hanif Korelitz. She also wrote The Latecomers. And it Roberta, have you read it?
I have not. No.
All right. Well, I know this has to do with copyright, because the plot of the book, called The Plot, is about somebody who somebody dies and they take their book. And I assume that you have a question along that line.
Absolutely, because I have a book club and we invited the author, and that was raised, and she gave her definition. And I thought your study was so relevant to that I just wanted your opinion on it. That was the first thing. And I would find that very interesting, but you haven't read it. My second comment is, and I love what you say about, I choked up, generation to generation, because I grew up in a very observant home. And I was very observant before we had children, and I incorporated Judaism into their life. Now that I have grandchildren and I watch my children raise their children, I could see what I couldn't see before, how I transmitted it knowingly, unknowingly. Values of Judaism, how they raise their children, and how they observe in this modern day world, this new remixed religion. There's such good examples of it. And I thought your talk hit home to me, and it encapsulated it really clearly for the good. So I'm going to buy your book for my kids.
Thank you.
And the link is in the chat. Thank you. Evie.
Okay, this is going to be hard following. I don't know your name that just spoke, because all of a sudden I'm getting teary-eyed listening to you, because I have the same feelings.
Yes.
Roberta, I have a pretty deep, steeped religious background. And I have to say that faith and God have never been part of it. I went to
Absolutely.
I went to the academy through 8th grade, then conservative Hebrew high school.
Yes, yes.
Eventually joined Solel many years ago, then went to Eitz Chaim for about 25 years, and then Lakeside, and we're back here.
Yeah.
And all through, I never heard, I have a lot of knowledge in my kishkis about ritual and tradition and so on and so forth, and I can spout about it. But never talking about God and faith. And I remember when my children were in religious school here, talking to the religious school director, and she said, we can't talk about it because our teachers are not comfortable talking about God and faith. And so I haven't been really comfortable talking about it with my children either, or my grandchildren. And yet I see now that one of them is in high school and very involved in Jewish organizations, as well as his brother and siblings, how just by watching and metamorphosis, they've incorporated, not, I don't think we speak the same language in terms of what we do, but a couple of things that have been very, very helpful for me. When we first joined Solel many, many years ago, and it was one of the early rabbis who talked about, it might have been Rabbi either Wolf or I don't remember, talked about walking down Judaism Street and picking up the pebbles on Judaism, some of which may be too heavy, some of which are not heavy enough.
Yes.
And that really helped me in terms of what path I was going through at the time and so on and so forth. But I also have to say briefly that one of my best religious experiences was I was a lonely 5-year-old girl because we had no children in the neighborhood. And I was playing outside, and it happened to be a beautiful April morning, and I was playing hopscotch by myself. And this man came up to me and said to me, did you go to church this morning? And I said, yes, I went to Ratzei Tzedek. Sunday, and it happened to be the second day of Pesach. And this nice looking tall man put his hands on my head and he said, bless you, my child. I didn't know at the time, but he was a late Cardinal Stritch. We lived across the street from home.
Wow.
And I have to tell you, I can still feel that in me, that somebody took the time to actually talk to this little girl, where I don't think that I had that. And I think that personal touch is so meaningful to, that sometimes is missing in the tradition.
As we get towards the end of the hour, as someone who's been on the front lines of both running a religious school, talking to teachers, I am always the first one to say and tell kids that I'm teaching or I'm in front of that I believe in God. And I think that by having these conversations with your children and your grandchildren is very helpful. I also think, although, Roberta, you said it's not on the front page, the discourse, I would say among my educational colleagues, we realize that ritual is very important, that people want ritual. And as far as our millennial and Gen Z participants, they're not institutionally loyal to anything. And this has hurt synagogue affiliation and that type of thing. I don't know that I would call it a religious thing. They don't, the famous book Bowling Alone. Yeah. So I think that by giving more meaning and by giving more ritual, which I see in all religious schools at doing a good job of that, kids today know what Shalach Manot is and Homentashen and all Tu B'Shvat and all the different Chagim. So and I certainly, as my cog in the wheel, I'm very proud of that. So and I think everyone on this Zoom, we're ambassadors, and you have to talk about it and do it. I do blessings with my personal children every Friday night, and we do the parental blessing, and we do it by FaceTime because they don't all live with me.
Which is
All
the
right, I
remix.
see Sandy has her hand up. Sandy?
Well, I really liked Evie's story. That's one thing. But my grandchildren were all bar mitzvahed, all together in Israel. We took them there. They were prepared here on the North Shore and then from different temples, but we took them to Israel to have the bar mitzvah at Masada. So I knew that they were Jewish, but I didn't see really their participation as they grew up. They're all in their mid-30s now. So I did something that turned out to be brilliant. I didn't even realize where it came from. I asked the cantor if he would do a baby naming, and we had it just 4 weeks ago at Solel, at Macomb Solel Lakeside. And I saw my grandchildren were so proud to see their little ones get up on the bimah, get Hebrew names, and they danced to the music of the cantor. It was so wonderful, and everyone taped it. And they've been watching it over and over, watching these little kids get Hebrew names. And I have, a lot of interfaith marriages among my grandchildren. So it was really beautiful to see some of the Gentile ones who haven't converted. They haven't converted, but they were so happy to see their little ones get named in temple.
That's great.
So,
That's a great idea. That is a great idea. And that's a great example of, how grandparents, I mean, we haven't really talked a lot, and I know we're at the end of our time, but there are ways that grandparents can actually facilitate the Jewish journeys of their grandchildren and their children without crossing lines and without, with keeping in those boundaries that are important for grandparents to keep within, so that they can actually do the influencing that they really want to do, right? And so I think that's a brilliant idea, and good for you to come up with that.
So Roberta, any last words for us?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the one last word I would have is, and this goes back to something that you just said a moment or two ago, Vanessa, about Gen Z not being institutional, and that is definitely true. But part of the problem with that is Judaism is a community religion, right? I mean, you can practice Judaism yourself, of course, but Judaism is really about community, and so the challenge, I think, is going to be for Jewish institutions, and particularly for religiously liberal institutions, to try to sort of light that fire and embrace. I think all the things that you mentioned, the Purim packages and the blessings and all of these things, that's great. For Jews that are affiliated with a synagogue and their kids are going to some sort of Hebrew school, that's really wonderful. The problem is there's declining affiliations, and that's not seen as significant. So that's going to be, I think, the challenge for the Jewish community, to really think about how are they going to basically, where are they going to direct their energies, and where are they going to direct their priorities, right? Because that's really going to be telling as to whether Steven Pinker's image of what religiously liberal Judaism is going to look like in 2050, which is a third of the Jews, or whether we can perhaps sustain it in a better way. But thank you all for coming, and I hope you will, I hope you will have an opportunity to read Remix Judaism and buy it for your kids, because I actually wrote this book for my kids, right? So I really wrote it for people in their 30s, 40s, and 50s, although a lot of my readers, and I think I've spoken at about 200 synagogues over the past 2 years, and most of my audience has been more my age and older. But
Listen, Roberta, if they buy the book, will you send them a signed book plate? And you can do that through me.
Yes, absolutely. I have book plates. I would be very happy to do that. So if you wanted to give me names, I can fill them out and I can mail them to you, or I can even drop them off. You're
perfect. Right.
But you're on
You're in the
Playmate,
corner.
right? You're on
All
Playmate.
right. Well, what an interesting morning. You've given us a lot to think about. Next week is Todd Rosenberg, and we're going to have a great session with him, and you're getting some kudos in the chat, Roberta.
Yeah.
And this week, Rabbi's second class on Prophet of the Andes, and he's just at the very beginning of the book if you want to join in. And there is I don't know if there's musical meditation yet because Cantor's still just back from Israel. And Rabbi Moffick's last class on A.J. Heschel on his 50th anniversary of his yard site. So it's good to see everyone. If you have any questions, you know where to get a hold of me. Bye-bye.
Bye.